No questions? Everyone's doing all good? How are you guys doing stress-wise in terms of managing the semester? I'm starting to catch whispers of exam conflicts and things of that nature. Is everyone doing okay in that direction? Stressed as always? Stress is optimal. Is there anything I can do in this course to help with the stress at all? Group projects, 3 tests. Right on. Sounds like things are getting a bit tough. So if there's anything you guys need that I could change in this course to help for stress, let me know. Time difference, I think. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. If there's anything, let me know. We can make it work. So we'll go from there. Okay. So a couple of things. It's getting to the point in the semester now, especially where I'm working with 2 universities, that I am often finding myself saying, let's set a time to meet, and then that time to meet just never comes because that's the way things are. So I have created a Calendly account, and I've posted it right here on Brightspace. So if you want to set a time to meet with me for any reason, just use Calendly, and then that will tell you the times I'm available, and then we can make a time. I posted that same information for the TAs as well, and the TAs have created a Discord server. I'm not monitoring the Discord server because I already have to pay attention to Slack and 2 different Teams channels, as well as iMessage and Zoom with you guys. So I am not able to monitor the Discord server. So if you want to bounce ideas off each other or ask the TAs questions in a place where the instructor isn't there so the ideas are safer, you can feel free to use that as a basis for that. If you want to take something from the chat and bring it to my attention, absolutely feel free. But I'm leaving it up to the TAs, and I think Julia is taking the lead on moderating it. Okay, so where I believe I left you guys last week was we were talking about the TOR browser, and we were talking about the network architecture that allows for that kind of privacy. So one of the things I told you about was that the cost of that level of anonymity comes with great cost to speed. So I'm going to run 2 speed tests. The one on the left is my computer with no connection to VPN and no access to TOR. It's just straight from my ISP. And the one on the right is going through the TOR network. So already you can notice. I want to let me. Okay. For some reason I can't see the screen to mute, but please make sure your microphone is on mute. So you will notice now the incredible difference in speed between my ISP and between the TOR browser. And this is just one instance. So my ISP already finished the test before the TOR browser was even at this speed. If you're wondering, who did I bribe to get that speed? No, so it's actually really weird that I have it. So we kind of have this joke that my family built Bell Canada. We haven't actually, but my uncle for a while was like CIO or some big executive position, and my grandfather and uncles were all working on the original telephone lines. So whenever anything good happens from Bell, we always like say it's that reason, but it has nothing to do with it. We used to get 100 straight down and I think like 10 up. And at one point, Mom just called Bell to cancel the satellite and fiber optic, and they were like, "Oh, we'll just if you hang on to it, we'll give you the fastest internet speed we can offer." And supposedly it's 500 megabits per second down. It's a straight fiber optic line. It's not always that fast though. It seems to be varying because you'll see now it just came in at 155, and the test I did when I was prepping the lecture came in at 300. Hold on. Is someone asking a question, or is that? or where do I see the, how do I mute?
网络不稳定。
Cool. Got it. Okay, so now let's look at some of the anonymous properties that are associated with the TOR network versus a straight ISP. So if you go to, for your own interest, what'smyip.com, it will tell you information that your browser is giving away. So this is useful to know for a variety of reasons. One is protecting your own privacy as an online web browser, but the other is you can detect and optimize app development based on browser settings. So for example, on the left, which is my Clearnet browser, I get a host name, so it tells me what network I'm on, which isn't really important for your purposes, except for privacy reasons. But it tells me this, what browser I'm using, what operating system I'm using, what version, what web agent. So one of the interesting things about the way the web developed is that every browser renders pages slightly differently. And this can mean, like, to Firefox, the idea of a couple of pixels or the idea of a certain tag might render differently between Firefox and Chrome. So this user agent, which is always accessible whenever someone makes a page and it's in the HTTP request, it gives information that you can use to render your website to be specific to the needs of that browser. Okay, I'm getting to that, don't worry, Jan. So now, if we look over at the Tor browser, it purposely is hiding all of my information. So the Tor browser cares not for if things are rendered properly. It cares for if things are private. So for example, Windows NT is a server operating system. It's not very often that you would browse the internet with a server operating system because server operating systems are specific. So this gets sent to whoever on the other end, and they can't tell I'm using a Mac. And it just so happens that it says Firefox because the Tor browser is rendered in Firefox. The chat's pointing out that this can be changed without using a VPN or without using Tor, and that's absolutely true. I thought NT was a code name for 32-bit Windows builds. Could be both. The only time I've ever actually, you might be right. I might be thinking of RT. RT might be the server. Let's find out. Now you've made me question myself. Windows NT. Family of operating systems. Processor independent. Yeah, workstations and servers. To be honest, I don't know my Microsoft stuff that well. As I've told you guys many times, I used to know everything about Windows 7 or everything I needed to know about Windows 7, but the whole Microsoft sphere is kind of a blur to me. So anyway, this is the different information that you will get between Tor and the regular. So depending on your needs, the speed break might be pretty useful for the amount of privacy, but as you can see, there's still similarities and that kind of thing. Okay, so last class, I was talking about how there are hackers on the dark web that are for hire, but I'm pretty sure that they are FBI scams. So this is one of the most famous dark web pages. And it says things that you can purchase for hacking for hire. So remote control, Facebook and Twitter account hacking, other social network account hacking, DDoS, hacking web servers. Now, I didn't get this off of some sketchy message board that's request only. I got this by putting into DuckDuckGo, which is the search engine of choice on the dark web, by typing in dark web hacker for hire. And what came up associated with it is a news story about a woman who paid $5,000 through that site or a similar one to arrange a murder on the dark web, and that person turned out to just take the money and then tip off the feds, and that person is now in jail. So the rumor that the dark web is a dangerous place has truth to some extent, but the idea that it's some massive mafia conspiracy that anyone can access is a bit far-fetched, because people are now pulling these scams where they get the Bitcoin to do the job, but they also get the tip money from the FBI for turning people in. All right, so the next thing I talked to you guys about last class was pretty good privacy. So I'm gonna get everyone to go to this link up here. I'll post it in the chat. And you should make a public and private key for PGP so I can show you how this encryption system works. And I think you'll find it's actually pretty ingenious what you're able to do with it. So what you can do is encrypt what you can do when you make a public key and private key is you can encrypt a message with your public key. And the only way that message can be deciphered is with a private key and a password. So if someone wants to send you a message, they encrypt it with the public key and they send it back to you, and then you're the only one that can decrypt it. So the way I like to think about it is I am going to get a box and I'm going to put a locker lock on it, but I'm not going to lock the locker lock because I actually don't know the code to unlock it again. And in that box, I'm going to take an encrypted message and send it to you, and then I'm going to lock the box, which now prevents me from going back in and tampering my own message. You are the only one that knows the key to open that box, and that the box is sent back to you, and you open the box and read the message. So when everyone's had a moment to create a public and private key, let me know, and I'll show you how it works. Other than losing your private key, how could it be broken? You mean breaking into the box, like breaking the encryption system? If there was a weakness other than brute force, I don't think it would be the encryption system of choice. It's actually really interesting how this mechanism works. So I'm sure you've all heard of the RSA algorithm before. Yeah, you've heard it's very out of scope for me to show you how that works, and I always have to slightly look it up because it revolves around a couple of very ingenious number theory tricks. But it was originally invented by the US government and then quickly set to top secret because of how useful it was for messages encoding. Then three guys, Rivest, Shamir, I think Allen was the third, RSA, they got together and they reinvented that crypto system. So it was like blowing a national secret accidentally. And one of the three guys, I'm not sure which one it was, basically only gave them this like awesome math trick that makes it all work and didn't do anything else. But it's without the trick, it's completely useless. So he gets all the credit. And no, like that's been a thing that's been around for a long time, and it's very, very difficult to reverse engineer RSA, and this relies on the same principle. What's the word? So the mathematical trick is called modular inverse, if you've ever heard it before. And wasn't there some kind of backdoor into RSA encrypt? I've never heard of one. So one of the things about crypto systems is when they're created, so be on the page I'm currently on. So you want to be PGP key generator. And then let me know when you're all finished. Okay, Jared's ready. Is everyone else ready? Done? Okay. So now once you have your public key, you can go over to the encrypt page. Oops. And you can enter in your public key. And Then you can type in your message. And the message becomes encrypted. So this is what will be transmitted over the network. So you'll notice it's not the same number of characters, so it would be very hard, if not impossible, to do any form of frequency analysis or anything like that. It can't be traced back. So then you send your message to whoever and paste in your encrypted message, type in the password associated with your public and private key. Don't save, and then your message is decrypted. So for participation today, what I'm going to get you to do is, encrypt a message using my public key, and then I will decrypt it for your participation. And I'll show you, well, a couple of you, I'd love it if you submitted it now so that I can show in class that it's decryptable. So my public key should be made available here, and then right above it is the link to do the encryption. Okay. So in the under content for October 1st, the participation October 1st, here's my public key, here's the link to do the encryption, and then the Dropbox is, for this I've actually disabled file submission and I made it straight text submission. Okay. So we'll look at Mahmoud's, what he sent. So here's a PGP encrypted message. I type in my password. This is a clever message. So I was able to decrypt that. Does that make sense to everyone? Like that's how PGP works. I don't want to get into the math behind how it works because it gets complicated in a hurry and it's going to require a whiteboard and a lot of one-on-one tutoring because it takes a while to wrap your head around the way it works. Cool, we'll try a couple more and then we can go on with the lecture. So let's see what Emerson sent me. Oh, forgot the password. White hat hackers rule. Okay, so we get the point of this. So what's going to happen on the dark web, how if you take 4116, which was one of my favorite courses I took in my master's, they cover exactly how this works. And if you come to my office hours or make an appointment with me, I will show you in depth how the math works behind it. What's that saying? So anyway, on the dark web, and anytime there's supposed to be anonymity, so like Snowden, for example, he on his page on the dark web and everyone he was contracting with, at the bottom of his emails, the bottom of the page, whatever, he just published his public key because anyone can see that. They can't do anything with it other than encrypt a message that they can't decrypt. So what happens is they'll say, here's my PGP key, you go do the decryption, and then you go do the decryption, and then that's how interaction happens. So that way you maintain encrypted communication while you're maintaining your anonymity, because if you're exchanging information in a way that can be intercepted, which is always, once it's intercepted, if they can decode it, that's a huge problem. So like, for example, HTTPS, which is the secure way of sending HTTP, there are places that can decrypt it that aren't the end nodes. For example, like they could be localized routers or sysadmins that have control of your computer or the server computer. But that wouldn't be the case with PGP if only you have the public key. Took all the math courses required for BCS, but still switched to BEX. Is that directed at me, Jared? No, I didn't take all those courses. I did BACS, and then in the last year I did like network security and communications. And in my master's, I just decided I was going to knock down any course that had security or networks in it. So I've taken every course at Dal that has either of those terms. I do like math, but I like management a lot more. Okay, what are we doing? Okay. So I got these slides from my supervisor at Carleton, and he was teaching this lecture the other night, and I was thinking two things. I was like, this is a really interesting intro lecture, but it's a shame this is a graduate course. And then I thought, hey, my students would love this. So I'm going to give you guys a lecture that I got the other night that I thought was really awesome. So there's this really good textbook that I highly recommend, and I didn't know about it until recently. It's called Computer Security Principles and Practice. One of the best textbooks I've seen in a while. So if you're ever in a used textbook store or something, I highly recommend picking it up. And these lecture slides are built based on that. So this is on user authentication. So what we're going to be talking about today is the difference between authorization and authentication and how that relates to you in your e-commerce projects as well as anything else you're going to be doing. One of the big challenges with anything web-centric is figuring out if your users are supposed to be, the users you have, the clients connecting to your program, are they supposed to be there? And we have so many different mechanisms for figuring that out, but the problem is there's, for every mechanism you can name that can be used to detect your identity, I can think of a way to break it. And the only way to truly get a good sense of if a user is supposed to be there is by implementing multiple ones simultaneously, because it's much harder to knock down a bunch of unique systems that are entwined together than it is to knock down one singular system. So we talk about authentication as the process of establishing confidence in user identities that are presented electronically to an information system. So it's not a guarantee. In research, we would love if we could snap our fingers and get rid of false positives and false positives and false negatives. We would love that, but we just can't do it. So there's always going to be an authentication. We're always going to have users that are meant to access the account but cannot because of whatever reason and how they've screwed up their passwords. And we're always going to have people that slide in under the radar. This is not just true for network security. We see this discussion with immigration all the time. And whenever immigration is discussed on the TV, my network security brain activates. And I'm like, you guys are thinking about this the wrong way. You have to be looking at it this way. Quick question. Having all passwords behind a single password control software is still secure in that regard to the sheer amount of protections of a single OS has nowadays? It depends on the service. So If it's all in a text file on your Windows or Mac or Linux, I would say no, but if it's in a password manager, I'd say yes. So like, typically speaking, I asked this question, the same question 2 years ago. I was at a plagiarism seminar in the first week of my master's, and Dr. Brodsky told us an example where there was 2 guys living in a dorm and they were roommates, and one of them got up to go to the bathroom but left his computer open, and the other one went in and stole his test answers or assignment or something. And I raised my hand and said, you know, there's 200 computer science grad students in this room. I'm sure if we put our heads together, we could probably get into the CIA or some other lofty goal. What is the like threshold for us doing our due diligence to protect against that threat? And the answer I got was, from a legal perspective, it's not illegal to break into something that isn't locked, but as soon as they break past the operating system security, even if it's poorly implemented or weak, at that point they are considered to be breaking and entering. So to answer your question, from a legal standpoint, it's probably strong enough to protect you from many threats, but I would definitely add another program that is designed to encrypt the passwords within the operating system. Okay, so here are identification requirements. Identifying information systems, users, processes, acting on behalf of users or devices. So one thing that you start to notice in large enterprise applications, especially ones that run on multiple servers or multiple buildings or in multiple parts of the world, is that processes all have owners. So every operating system, what is it? Activity monitor. Every operating system has a way of seeing what all the processes are. These are processes that are running on your computer. A computer cannot run without processes. As originally, computers were designed to only run one program. That's what all those breadboards used to do back in the day. Then someone said, hey, what if the only one program the breadboards run is an operating system, and then it manages the programs inside? And those programs it's running are called processes. So let's take a look at some of the processes running on my computer. Now, on my computer, you see that the user is always me. There's not a single case where it is not. On a server computer, nothing could be further from the truth. You will see processes associated to almost every user in the organization. The more cloud-oriented your computers are, the more processes are going to be coming from different users. However, there is a caveat. Occasionally, sometimes the administrator who created the account will retain ownership of processes. So I think I told you guys before about one time when I was working for defense and we were doing a scan for people who had installed unauthorized software. And my boss, who was in charge of the accounts for all 22,000 people in the National Capital Region, his name was flagged as the owner of all this illegal software and all these illegal processes. And we were like, oh man, does this dude have some explaining to do? And we went and talked to him and he was like, oh, that, yeah, like in the way Active Directory works, the way we've implemented it, whoever creates the account maintains ownership of the processes. So depending on how you configure things and depending on the level of privilege needed, it is occasional that the administrator will retain the process. So this is one way of verifying who is using your software, is you can look at who's owning the process. Because if you've got a process that's owned by a user that you don't identify in your system, well, then that's likely you might have some intrusion detection, an intruder, and then you can look at like, say, your firewalls, or you can look at other things like your logging and your auditing systems to see if they tell a similar story that builds to the pattern of there being an intruder. Because as I told you guys earlier, you name me any defense mechanism, I'll tell you what its vulnerability is. Where their strengths are is in using them together. Okay. So then you can authenticate the identities of those users, processes, or devices as a prerequisite. So that's pretty well what I'm talking about. Anytime you plug something in or someone joins, it has to be known. Do I have one on my desk? I do not. USB sticks. USB sticks are hilarious because they have on them built right into their process is a unique identifier. And pretty much anytime any chip is manufactured in mass anywhere, that unique identifier shows up. And at defense and most organizations, whenever a USB is plugged in to any networked or organized computers like that, the virus scanner or any sort of monitoring software will notice a new device. They'll grab that ID number and put it in the database. So now in most organizations, what happens is office admins go out and buy a bunch of USB sticks, and then they call tech support and say, okay, plug in one in, grab the ID, okay, that one's valid, okay, and so forth. But then every once in a while, someone just goes to Dollarama, buys 40 of them, and then plugs them in, and that starts a huge issue of, oh, did someone infiltrate the system? And if a piece of hardware that isn't authorized by the system, by the administrators, enters the system, even in arguably legitimate ways, that piece of hardware is still identified as rogue. For example, there's no one I envy less in this whole world than the person that has to go tell people, hey, you plugged in your cell phone to a government computer and they have now joined, which legally means that cell phone is now part of the government. We have to take it and destroy it. And I've always asked, like, well, what happens if they won't give it? And it's like, well, then we lock their account until they give it. Then it's like their job or their phone. And I'm just, why would you do that? I get it, but why? But anyway, so anytime there's rogue hardware, you have to authenticate it. Because even if an authorized user plugs in like a USB that is unauthorized, you can't know if that's a legitimate person or if that's someone that got access and is now doing a data grab, like a Snowden style data grab. And that's a huge piece of thing to keep in mind. So user authentication is a huge factor in determining the safety of your applications, but also we look at other things that are plugged into the computers. And this is especially true in a large network device, because can you imagine what would happen if someone went into Facebook and just plugged in a random USB hard drive, like what they could grab? It would be horrible, right? So that's something you need to think about when you're worrying about building an application that's accessible from everywhere, is what is the consequence of your data going to the wrong place? And that's why we have to authenticate users. So we then can think about things like multi-factor authentication. It is hard to spoof two-factor authentication. It's not impossible. So like when a code gets sent to your phone, in addition to your login, to spoof that, you need a device called a femtocell, which duplicates cellular networks long enough to grab data and intercept it. But it's very expensive to implement, and it's very tricky to do it right. And you're not just going to get it off a YouTube tutorial. And if you do that, you'll be guilty of about just turning it on without authorization. You could be guilty of messing with Canadian cell networks. And in these days of 5G and Huawei, highly, highly do not recommend. Okay, replay resistant authorization mechanism. So a lot of the time what happens with a login is the server will generate a random number and send that to the person logging in, and that random number can't be reused for the next little while, and it wouldn't be anyway because it's random. But if 2 minutes later that same number were tried to be used again, the server would deny that because it would think it's like being subjected to a replay attack, which is where you intercept the packet and then retransmit it as though it were your own, which is something I'll show you how to do later this term. All right, so prevent reuse of identifiers for a defined period. Disable identifiers after a defined period of activity. So again, catch and release is exactly the right strategy. So if an account is disabled for 6 months or a year, you want to lock it and then make the person have to put in additional effort to get back in. Who knows what can happen if that's not the case. You're leaving yourself open to vulnerabilities, and those passwords could later be found in data breaches. Minimum password complexity, but I've told you guys about this many times. Don't make them reset it too often. Password reuse, etc., etc. All right, so I want to explain this. So this is referring to having a third-party verification. So one thing that we do a lot of in the world is we trust the computers to take us to the right place. So as I said before, if I type in facebook.com, what's going to happen is my computer will see if it has the IP address of Facebook stored in its local memory. And if it doesn't, it will make a query to the DNS server using the DNS address I provided by my ISP or that I've rewritten. And it will query the DNS server. And the DNS server will return an IP address. It's a simple lookup. And what I can do is I can go and make my own DNS server and get you to change your IP address to that server. And when you ask me the IP address of facebook.com, I can provide you the IP address of something that looks like Facebook, but is actually just me with a keylogger trying to grab your Facebook password. And how we stop those types of attacks is we have certificates. So when you are browsing over HTTPS, you always see that little lock that's there. The other part of that is sometimes you see a little certificate or diploma. That is a certificate from a trusted third party that is validated that you are going to the right IP address, and that this site that it takes itself seriously enough to have a certificate, you're going to the right place. So if you go to Facebook and you don't get that certificate and you don't have HTTPS, but you see that it still looks like Facebook, then you can take another look. Of course, the problem is there's actually big issues with certificate authorities right now. They are set by the individual applications and sometimes the individual web servers. So users will experience different blocks and different passageways depending on how the website is configured. Lately, what's just been done in research is I actually just read this paper. They've come up with a way to make authentication for certificates at the operating system level and provide it as a unified service. And that's a big deal in the security community, so that the user can be trained more consistently how to spot a spoofed page and know that they're in the right place. So you see here, the subscriber or the claimant, that's you or that's your user. Identity proofing, they register with the registration authority, and then the credential service provider. So the token is sent, and then the identity is proofed. So we get it checked in two places. We have it log in and go to the right place, but we also check that the credentials are valid, and we can verify in another case if there's anything that needs to be verified. So like if the data is being transmitted authentically. The four meanings of authentication, of authenticating user identity based on. So something the individual knows, a password, an old pet from back in the day, their old school, their mother's maiden name. Something the individual possesses, smart card, electronic key card, physical key, something the individual is. So your fingerprint, your retina, things that never change over time. And then there's something that the individual does. Voice pattern, handwriting, typing rhythm. So we have all kinds of ways of doing these, and a lot of these happen without you even noticing them. So one of the ways I recommend that you secure your web applications is by looking at something the individual does. So those are things that happen behind the scenes that might actually be a third type of authentication that you might not notice that often. Those are things like if you go to another part of the world and log into your Google account and they say this is a suspicious login, that means that you've given the right password and maybe even the right two-factor authentication, but you are not behaving like you normally do. So we're trying to make sure that you're not some weird body double or that kind of thing. And they make you authenticate with another step to make up for that, because it is possible. It actually is possible that you just traveled around the world. Yeah, connected from a different ISP. Like I get this. This happens to me all the time. Whenever I change around the VPNs to get access to whatever streaming service I'm trying to do, every once in a while that'll mean another one will be like, hey, you're normally connecting from New York, but now you're connecting from New Jersey or California or Texas. Like this isn't the pattern that you've been showing for a while, and then it makes them think that I'm somewhere I'm not supposed to be, and like that can actually be a thwart to their terms of use, right? Because like I'm not allowed to access Hulu outside of the US. I do anyway with a VPN, and I've put a very good job into making them think I'm at this one spot in the US, and I've fed them very specific coordinates. So according to Hulu, I haven't moved in like a month and a half, but whenever I accidentally do or I accidentally forget to turn on the VPN, it will go crazy and think that I am nowhere near where I'm supposed to be and that I'm using a VPN. Anyone have any questions on that? Okay, so we have multi-factor authentication. So we have the authentication logic using the first factor, so password, then you pass, and then we have the second two-factor authentication. So you guys have seen that before. We don't need to worry about it too much. So risk assessment. This is where things get really interesting, and it's where you start seeing money getting put into cybersecurity and money getting skipped. So sometimes every once in a while, you'll get hired to do a quick little job, and you'll make an app that works, and the people won't even want to pay for cybersecurity because the risk of a data breach will mean nothing to them. So, like, for example, if you just build something that makes it convenient, and we have to think about where, especially web-centric, what the risk level are, because anyone, if you're making a web app, anyone can access it from anywhere, which automatically raises your level of risk from minimal to at least moderate. Because if you're just writing a bunch of silly scripts in the office to automate out some paperwork, it doesn't really need to be security. But if you're doing anything with facing the web, there's a potential chance of a payout. When the NB government, provincial government systems got hacked in 2019, they decided they needed to increase the budget by 100K. Yeah, that's nothing. Like, security costs in the millions and lack of security costs in the billions, so keep that in mind. So we have assurance levels. So assurance is related to our level of risk. So for example, if I'm running a bank, it's really, really, really important to me that I know the right person is accessing the service. Because if, let's say you have $10,000 in your savings and you've got your RRSP and all these things, and like you can, like, if you're a retired person and you've got your RRSP, your TFSA, your checking account, your savings account, that can be $500,000. And if someone gets in there and uses the site improperly, they can take $500,000 that the bank has to repay. Now, if I'm running a streaming service like Netflix and someone gets into the system and just watches some Netflix, that doesn't actually change my cost benefit too much. I mean, obviously I would like it if the amount of people that are paying for the service is the amount of people that are watching at most. But if it's a compromised account, that doesn't actually mean any losses for me, because the person using the account is doing nothing different than the person who owns the account would do, and it's not at any greater cost because it's still a paid account. All right, so then we can start looking at degrees of confidence so that we can know whether or not someone is joining our system without access, and we have to know what our level of risk is as well. So depending on the level of risk of a break-in, you need to have the level of confidence to be your threshold. So level 1, little or no confidence in the asserted identity's validity. So that's someone who typed a bunch of passwords and got it on the 15th guess and is accessible over TOR and completely unrelated, looks nothing like the profile of a usual login. Level 4, that's someone who is accessing from the browser they regularly access, got the password on the first try, got the two-factor authentication on the first try. That's another thing, actually. So what some browsers will do to fingerprint you is use the cookies that can be used to track you and your purchases can also be used to see if you're still you. So if you go delete all your cookies, you might find, and try to log in, you might find that your browser or websites you access don't trust you as much as they used to, because they can't see the fingerprint profile that really only you can create by going about your daily life. So these are things that might, like things like your cookies might shift you from a level 4 to a level 3, where we go, oh, it seems like you, but you know, are you on speakerphone this time? In retail, aggravated theft costs are factored into the purchase price. So risk is, I have a friend who's got a master's in economics, and I might ask his opinion on that question, because I can kind of answer that, but I think he would like smash it out of the park. Risk is something that's traded. That's what financial stock is. So we're always trading risk of like, will the company go up? Will the company go down? Like in terms of stock. And the same thing happens with cybersecurity, where we know that if a company gets knocked over, like a company that's designed to keep data secret, like Google or Dropbox or like stuff that's secret to you, if it goes and has a data breach, that causes a lack of trust that they can maintain their service, which causes risk of it going down. So risk is often hemorrhaged and sold off and traded upon, right? So it's difficult to say how that works. It's going to be a different model for each corporation, but definitely like a CIO, Chief Information Officer, will spend most of their day thinking about the risk of a financial, the financial risk of a data breach and how to protect it. So like, for example, a CIO might think, oh, there's a new vulnerability out there that affects this one type of computer that we only have 10 of, and those computers aren't connected to anything important. But it'll cost $10,000 to replace those computers and $100,000 if there's a breach, but the likelihood of a breach is less than 1%. Like, will they spend that $10,000 to prevent spending that $100,000? Maybe, maybe not, but then their very next decision is, oh, there's another vulnerability out there that affects every Windows computer in existence, and the patch costs $1 million, and every computer in the office is Windows, and the potential of breach is $100 million. Well, they're going to patch it. So it's that level of managing risk is a CIO level decision. It's all they're ever doing all day is looking at graphs and actuarial tables to see if they should risk making a software decision. Right. So I think I covered all of this. So we can look at potential impact, inconvenience, distress to damage your reputation. So again, if MasterCard has a bunch of credit card numbers leaked and then has a hard time like resolving all of the credit card fraud as a result of that, that would be a huge damage to their brand, and a lot of people would be going to Visa. Financial loss or organization liability. So for example, if the organization handled its own transactions like credit card processing, and it was their mechanism for handling those transactions that was breached, they might be liable for some of the fraud that took place. And because of that liability, it might ruin the company. Harm to organizations, programs, or interests. So if you, a good example for this. You've got a company that does something political. I can't think of anything off my head right now. And that company has a goal, and hackers have the opposite goal. Shutting down your company could reduce your ability to save. So for example, if there was like a vaccine manufacturing plant that was run by Bill Gates, and it was designed to make billions of COVID vaccines, and there were a group of anti-vaccine hackers that got into it, that thought that this was going to be part of some big monitoring plot or something ridiculous, they could halt the needs of the organization, which might on a big enough scale could shift the way the world moves, or shift the way an idea is processed, or COVID causes 5G networks. Okay, I'll take that one. That's a much better inference than 5G networks cause COVID, because okay. Personal safety. So those are only really a problem at the individual levels, unless you're talking about like a bomb threat or something, but those aren't going to come in from cybersecurity. Those are going to come in like in another way. Civil or criminal violations. So again, those are more on the individual scale. Password-based authentication. So one thing we were talking about in my research group this morning is how difficult it is to change anything on the internet. So passwords are with us, I would bet, for at least the next 10 or 20 years, if not more. And now that I say that, I'm sure in 2 years, no one's going to use passwords again. But it's so difficult to change like a paradigm on the internet. So we've identified a lot of problems with passwords, from key logging to password reuse, to password complexity, to sticky notes with passwords. But they are a ubiquitous system. And there's actually a lot of merit in using things that are ubiquitous. For one thing, you can have deniability when there's a breach in your application. You can say, well, we'll use the industry standards, what everyone else is using. And also, the more used a service or encryption scheme or anything like that is, the more it's tested on a daily basis, and the more you can be assured that it's tamper resistant. It's never going to be tamper proof, but it does give you some sense of security. The problem with password-based authentication, as I've already discussed, is that it's not very good on its own, but when combined with other methods, it's quite useful. So this is the order of ways to attack a password. So the first step to attacking a password is an offline dictionary attack. So Have I Been Pwned has a feature that will let you check some of the most common dictionaries for passwords, and you will find that some passwords have tons and tons of reuse. So for example, the password Nicole has 284,519 reuses. So these are not proportional. So for example, some complicated password that you came up with you may be the only person in the world that's using that password, but the password, also known as password, has been used 3,759,315 times at least, and has showed up that many times in a breach. So that is the first step, is a dictionary attack. Those can be run easily through Kali Linux. There is a file somewhere in your system called rocku.txt that contains a word list of the most commonly used passwords. This even tells us where it is. I just want the list itself. So these are some of the most commonly used passwords. 123456, 12345, password, I love you, princess, 12345667, rock you. So these are all useful passwords. There are programs in Kali that will let you run them. Typically, THC Hydra is what most people use, but it depends on if you're doing offline or network cracking. Typically, the reason for that is with like a web-based cracking, what you're going to have to do is get the exact way the request is made, which is something I'll show you how to do later on. Okay, and then once the dictionary attack, okay, one of you has got your microphone off again. Oh, there's the participants thing. Okay, there we go. Mute all. Who's hiding behind this? Okay, so offline dictionary attack, specific account attack is the next one. So that offline dictionary attack, what you do is you just get the commonly used passwords and the list of data breaches, and then combine the two of them, and what you end up with is some random person's account that by a little bit of trial and error you end up with. If that doesn't work, let's say you need specific permissions, you can do a specific account attack. So from there, you decide, okay, this is the username I want to use. Now I'm going to fire a much longer but still popular password attack at. There's a longer version of rocku.txt in Kali that I think is over a gig, and it contains like the top million password, the top 100,000 or something. So you combine that password guessing against a single user, works or it doesn't. Next thing they could try is workstation hijacking. So that's sending them a link saying, hey, you've just got your dream job, click here and log in, and or hey, you just won the lottery, that kind of thing. And they're actually downloading a keylogger or something of that sort. Then from that workstation hijacking, you run an exploit, and then try the exploit to get the password, and then you monitor either with a keylogger or something like that, and you should be in. Is there any questions on that? Because I'm going to teach you how to defend against these in a second. Okay, so how do you guys think we defend against this? Max tries, you limit the tries, IP address ban lists. You also have a second factor of some kind. It all depends on the nature and risk associated with the accounts, but ideally, someone should never get past the third step. There's always going to be a way to do an offline dictionary attack. There's too many IP addresses to attack from, and there's always going to be a way to get someone's username without their password, because it's usually their email address. The popular password attack is where it should stop. Once they start firing away with the list and you can detect that, that's when you gotta identify who they are through their fingerprints, and then even if the cops can't catch them, block them with your firewalls so that they max out their tries. All right, I don't think you guys need to know about hashing in this course. All right, so I just talked about password cracking. So there's a couple dictionary attacks. So I just told you guys how those work, rainbow tables. Okay, so rainbow tables are lists of, so there's multiple kinds of encryption, and some people will tell you that one of the types of encryption is hashing, and that's not necessarily something I agree with. Hashing is a one-way function, which means that the input is converted to the output, and there is no way to mathematically return from the output to the input. And the only way to do that is to have the original input. So what some mechanisms for authentication will do is they'll say, let's get a hash. So one of the most common hash algorithms is SHA-1. Actually, that one is deprecated now. SHA-256 hash. So we'll type in a password. And then what people do is they store this password as in the database, and then they just do a comparison. They take the password that you give and they hash it with their hashing algorithm, and then just do a string compare to see if they're equal. The problem with that is that there are hash tables out there that let's see. Where am I? Website. It used to be, it's the name of that site. MD5? Oh, there's rainbow table. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so I can now take the hash and see if anyone's ever used this password before, and then we'll see if it's ever been cracked before. So no one's ever used CSCI 3172 as a password in a data breach. But if I go and make a password, let's say password, and I take that hash, we can see that someone has already used that password. So the problem with hashing is that, well, it's not reversible if the password's ever been breached before, or if ever someone's gone and done a brute force case with, which requires typically Bitcoin mining type hardware, they've gone and broken the hash through brute force, and that password has now been added to a list. Now, there are too many passwords that are possible for there to be a list of all of the tables, but unfortunately, this still exists. So how we counteract against this is something called SALT, which is another round of hashing and encryption on this that's unique to the specific authentication process, and it is much, much harder to reverse those. I don't say impossible in the sense that it can't be done. I guess that would mean impossible. What I mean is it's very, very difficult technically, but there are mechanisms to go around it faster. Right, usually when I say the word impossible with terms of passwords, I mean there's no way other than brute force. Okay, another thing included in your Kali Linux is something called John the Ripper, which is a very useful tool. It's an open source cracker that can be used to break a wide variety of things. It's also good at cracking rainbow tables. So those salt things I was telling you about, for example, they can be cracked. It just takes a lot of computing power. And if it takes more computing power, time, and money than it does to then is the value of what's passed the password is protecting, then in my opinion, the resource is properly protected. Because I'm not going to spend $1,000 to steal $100. I don't think you would either. All right, so here's a graph of the percentage of passwords guessed after a given number of guesses. So 10 to the 13, which is a huge number, by the way. What's that, a trillion? I think so. Yeah, it's a trillion. Actually, it's 10 trillion. So after 10 trillion guesses, you have just under a 40% chance of getting a password correctly. However, 10 trillion is not a small number. I think people are often, like people who are new to number theory often get confused by the logarithmic scale, and they think that, you know, it's like, well, there's a 10, and there's 100, and there's 1,000, and 10,000, and so forth. The scale between those is actually ridiculously massive. Like, one thing that always blows my mind to think about is that the difference between 0 and a billion is pretty close to the difference between a million and a billion, if you think about it. It's almost the same. So like on that scale, so you think about that, then a billion, how many billions go into a trillion, and then multiply that by 10 to get 10 trillion. That's a lot of guesses. So that's going to be a lot of hardware. And for that lot of hardware, that's going to be a lot of energy. And so there's going to be a power draw. You have to pay your electric bill, or you have to siphon electricity from somewhere. And because of all that, you then have to get into this thing. IoT vulnerabilities becoming botnet armies. So yes, IoT technology is redefining this, because the way I think about processing power is how Bitcoin is mined, because that's at least what my friends are into. But what people are able to do is, if they're able to see IoT devices on the web and hack into them easily, they can add them to their botnet army. So they do like one try hacks, and if the hack works, they add it to their botnet. And there's enough devices out there with vulnerabilities that it's easy to do that. So for example, if there's a smart toaster somewhere that has a vulnerability, I'd be willing to bet that more than one person bought that smart toaster. So all of those out there on the network that are exactly the same can all be added to the botnet and be used for the processing power. Still though, that's a lot of work. So password access control can block online guesses by denying access to encrypted passwords. So we talk about privileges, and we also have a shadow password file, which is where you would put the hash. Weaknesses in the OS that allow access to that file. So for example, in Linux, the root can see the hash file. So for the passwords on that account, which means that though they still have to do the job of reversing it, it's still not good form that someone with root access could get those hashes to begin with. Unfortunately, we have to make them visible, just the way the operating systems are built. But with root access, there's almost nothing you can't do anyway. But getting those hash passwords, that's a huge deal, because then you can take them offline, crack them offline, and come in first try with the passwords. So vulnerabilities to passwords, actionable permissions, users with the same password on their systems. So I've talked about that already. Access from backup media. So if we plug in a USB stick, that one of the most famous hacks of all time was just people sprinkling USB sticks that had malware all over parking lots. And then people picked them up and went, hey, a free USB stick, plugged in their own computer, and then the hacks started happening without them even noticing it. So one of the ways we undo this is user education, computer-generated passwords, reactive password checking, and complex password policy. it is your responsibility as web-centric developers and computer scientists to think about your password policy and make one that is usably secure. If there's a breach and it's because of a complex or weird password policy or because of your engineering of the authentication mechanism, you may be liable legally, if not at least ethically and professionally, because it's pretty hard to get hired at another security firm or another corporation if you were in charge of security at a place that had a very publicized breach. So reactive password checking. So whenever you think there's a breach, you go through and you make sure that everyone's up to code on their passwords, which should happen automatically anyway. Password checker. So what you can do is go look for all these tables of passwords that have shown up often and then add them to your password list of passwords that are banned. Oh, I remember her. Oh, she was awesome. Yeah, she was an older woman. She actually took 2201 with me back in, God, what year is that? 2016. And she was so cool. Like, she'd raise her hand and she'd be like, I have a question. What if this hack would work? And Nira would just be like, yes, come hack. So you can create large table, just like I told you guys with the TOR network IP addresses, you can create large band lists for passwords. Do this in moderation because you might get people that, if they use the same password for everything, have to come up with a new password and therefore write things down. Filters. So then we look at ways why is she putting malware into people's computers? I don't know, teach them a lesson. There's a couple of people in CompSci that are notorious, I'm not one of them, but are notorious for running simple little schemes like that to teach people to be more careful. One other thing is, whenever you're, does anyone here lock down their USB ports? No, because I'm lazy. But I should. Memory cards, smart tokens, we talked about all this stuff already. Electronic identity cards, talked about this stuff. User authentication with an EID. So we make, for example, with a, good point, Jared. With a third-party authentication, it's like I showed you before. There's an exchange between the host and the server, but then there's another exchange between the server and the verification server. So that's like if you're using like Google to log in, so you don't have to make a new account, or if you're using like OrcID or Facebook or Apple to log in. Biometric, we don't need to talk about that. So this graph took me a little while to understand. And it's something that I don't expect you to understand right away, but I'd like you to take a good look at it, and I'll post these slides later. But what this graph is saying is the probability of an imposter versus a genuine login. So the matching score is the thing to look at. So the matching score is S, is greater than so we are looking at what is a match between the authorized user that we know of in theory and we've built up in our database as someone who has access to a resource, and the physical, existing, breathing human that actually is none of those things and is only those things on a higher plane of existence. What match do we have together? Because you can take my picture with and make a driver's license, and you can create a whole other identity with just my picture, and someone can steal that and pass all these tests. So it's always a confidence thing. And at the end of the day, in the grand scheme of the universe, I am not the identity that my driver's license is attached me to. According to existentialism, I'm my own thinking, breathing being that is unrelated to that identity. But for the purposes of cybersecurity, we have to see what best way we can match the existing self to a cyber identity that has access to a resource. So we can look at the profile of an imposter and see that with a low matching score and a high probability, their profile happens early on. But with a higher matching score and a lower probability density function, we see that false matches are possible, but we move towards a greater certainty of a genuine user. So as we start up, we see we have very little in a matching score. We're not likely to have any match whatsoever. Like right as that curve starts, it's obviously a fake. We got someone accessing the network through a VPN and TOR. We've got the wrong password. We've got a username we don't know. They're trying common passwords. Nothing. And the decision, exactly. And that's where we talk about the decision threshold, which is T. And that is where you see these false positives and false negatives. This is where people skirt the system and get through on a forgot your password scheme. Like they go through and it says, what was your favorite pet's name, or what was your mother's maiden name? And someone goes on Ancestry or Facebook and looks this up and gets through. Or this is also someone who is in a new part of the world and is accessing normally, but it doesn't look like the way they normally look like. So we see that weird degree of, is it them or isn't them? And then once we're past them with the profile, there's a pretty good certainty that there's a match. Now, depending on the needs of your organization, you are going to take a vertical line and you are going to draw it somewhere on this graph. And you are going to say, that is the threshold of risk that I am comfortable with for letting somebody in. So if you work for a federal government and use the top secret service, your line is going to get drawn right here, like right where it says matching score. There cannot be a shadow of a shred of a doubt. If you are Netflix and there's no cost benefit and there's no loss to someone else logging in, and they paid for a service that depends mostly on a model of always being available, you are going to put your line in the opposite direction. So this is where web really intersects with cybersecurity, and it's why we talk about cybersecurity so much in this course. Is you have to make very difficult decisions at almost every single point that match between the level of risk you're comfortable with taking and the importance of the service you're providing. Because if the fundamental model of your service is confidentiality, then you've got a high degree of risk that needs to be dealt with. But if you've got a website like Netflix or Amazon or Reddit, where the fundamental model of your site is availability, you want a very low level of risk for authentication so that you can maintain your standard of feeling as available as possible. Because I'm sure we've all been locked out of our own accounts at one point or another, and we have felt that the site isn't available, and that can be infuriating. So the fewer steps for the authenticating user, the closer these two humps will be. I'm not sure, actually. That's a good question. I would say more think about it as the straight middle decision threshold that's generic is happening right here in this sort of a mass where it's more likely that they're going to be a false match possible than an imposter match in this zone. So you're going to move this around, but what's not really going to change too much is the probability of it being an imposter versus the probability of it being genuine. So don't think about moving the two curves. Think about moving your decision threshold T, which refers to the point when you're okay with saying, okay, we think this is a person who has the right to be here. Because as soon as you cross that line, you let them in, even if you aren't 100% sure. So you put that line where it's best for you. These are all graphs that I haven't memorized. I haven't studied these graphs enough to give you guys a proper lecture on them. Then of course we run into problems as well with remote user authentication, which is what I've been talking about the whole time, so I won't worry about it too much. And then these are just challenge response mechanisms. So for example, the user makes the request, the host sends a random number, and then the client sends something else back, and then they return a yes or a no. These are ways that you can have an exchange. It's easier to explain these with actual examples, so I won't I won't leave you guys in the land of theory for too long, but basically, if you think of a way you can exchange something without too much, like if you think of a unique way of verifying it's a valid request. So for example, sending a random number and knowing that that random number hasn't been used recently, as I talked about before, so that we can see that things haven't been replayed. Just a way of making things unique enough that there's ways to validate it. So these are some potential attacks and authentications. So for a client attack, we attack a password, either a token or the biometrics, so we can guess them, exhaustive search. We can trick the bio scanner somehow, and the typical defenses, large amount of possible passwords with limited attempts. So if there's 10 trillion possible passwords in 3 attempts, your odds are somewhere between remote and none. Host attack, password, token, biometric again, except this time we look more at a plain text theft, a dictionary, exhaustive search, and the defenses are hashing, large entropy protection, and protection of password database. Tokens, just use a one-time passcode, don't give them another one. Biometric, capture device, authentication, challenge response. So there's plenty of ways to do it there. Eavesdropping, so that's when you're the third person. Shoulder surfing, looking over someone's shoulder when they type in the password. Typically people either type fast or they use, one strategy I use on OSX, and I'll show you in my URL here, is if I hold the option button, so normally I just go ABC, but if I hold the option button, I get these symbols that are very uncommon. So then D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. So that's the whole alphabet on OSX if I type it in while holding the option key, which is an entirely different system that people will not have memorized. So for a lot of my passwords, what I do is I have some memorable passphrase that's very long and hard to attack, but then I hold the option key for some or all of it so that there are symbols that are much more unpredictable. Because like, even for a lot of my passwords, if you showed me them in plain text, I actually wouldn't recognize them because I'm not fully sure how they manifest themselves. I just know that it works. Okay. So replay attack, so that's when you capture something and you send it as if it was an original, which you can do using Kali Linux again, using a program called Burp Suite, which I will show you how to use in Lab 5/6. What are password parameters that don't allow special characters? It depends. Those usually have like different risk assessments, right? So there's also large entropy. So if I have a range that's acceptable, like I always try to go for longer passphrases, and then there's usually 2-factor authentication as well that gets used when they don't allow that. So like you often have to make a different like a assessed risk decision whenever you're making passwords, but when I have free reign, that's the strategy I go for. I always enable 2-factor authentication when I can, and I try to use my password manager as much as possible. Okay, authentication security issues, so eavesdropping, people listening in, people watching over, host attacks, directed to the user, file at the host where the passwords, token, passwords are stored, replay where you try to use the same authentication as the last person. This is where you attack a legitimate user. Trojan horse, so we're all familiar with the Trojan horse pretending to be something else and going in with a disguise. And finally, denial of service, which is if I can't get in, none of you can get in because I'm going to make so many requests that I'll have to be turned down and there won't be enough processing power to let anybody else in. Cool. So does anyone have any questions about authentication and how it relates to web-centric computing? Isn't blocking special characters for using when they're creating their own password a form of protection against injection? There are many, many ways to protect against injection without telling the client what they can and can't put in. So some of the things you can do to prevent against injection are called using prepared statements. So a prepared statement is saying, this is the query you are to expect. It will be one query, no add-on queries, and it will query this table for it will query a table for this record, and the only thing to change is this one variable. And if there's any form of tampering or attempts at injection, the injection characters will be treated as literal, and then nothing will come up in the database, and the query will return null. There's also a couple other injection proofing methods. You can put in, you can put into your MySQL database or SQL database, you can create users, and the users are only allowed to use, let's say, select and insert in only the bare minimum queries they need. And then whenever somebody makes a request to your MySQL database, they're not actually requesting with administrator privileges, but they're requesting with standard privileges that can't do that much. They can't do drop, they can't do delete. So principle of least privilege is usually the solution to that. Are there other questions about password authentication? No? Okay, so we're pretty well out of time, so you gotta run, you gotta run. I just wanted to talk to you guys about two quick housekeeping things. So the first is, a lot of the TAs have been telling me that more than one person has asked them a very generic question, like, oh, hey, what's the due date on this or something? And then some people are saying, can I have the 5%? I'm a person that is really not driven by grades. I never had a 4.0 GPA when I was an undergrad. I always preferred learning to grades. And if I had my way, we wouldn't have grades at all. But unfortunately, I'm required to have grades. So what I do is I build the course in a way that if you do it the way we ask you to do it, when you get to industry, they're going to be like, oh, you're so valuable, let's promote you, give you a raise and everything else, because you get how industry works, because there's no grades in industry. So I really want you guys accessing the TAs. They know things that I don't. That's why I hired them. I don't need to hire people that tell me what I already know. I want experts in their field. So they're a really good resource that I want you guys to be taking advantage of. So I'd much prefer it if you have more meaningful interactions with them and don't ask them if it's good enough for the 5%. Instead, just ask them your questions, meet with them, and they will keep note of it. And they will put in your feedback if you get the 5% or not. It's okay to ask them if you've had like 10 emails in exchange and you seem to be becoming pals with them, but it's not something I'd expect in a 2 or 3 email exchange. The second thing I want to talk to you guys about is, you guys in the chat seem to really like it when I get into security stuff. The way the course is built, we hit everything in the syllabus through the labs and through the project. The lectures are designed to enrich you in ways that will help you in your labs and project, but they have a bit more flexibility. So if there is a topic in a networking, security, or UI or web development space that you have struggled with in other classes, or that you need to do to get into co-op or some dream job, send me an email and tell me what it is, because I will give a lecture on it. I really want you guys to tell me what you want to learn, because I sometimes get really excited when I see you guys getting excited in the chat, and sometimes that steers my plan for the next lecture. So if there's like a pen testing technique, a web design framework, anything with networks that you want to learn, just send me an email and we'll make it happen. Does anyone have any other questions? Question about lab 2. It's about the framework we will work on. Does that mean it's a lab? No. So there's I've got this question before, so I'm glad you asked. In lab 2, it asks you what framework you want to use. That's the framework that you're going to bring to the table to your group and negotiate with. So it doesn't have to be the framework you end up doing. It just has to be like, this is the framework that you want to learn, and if you get into your group and someone changes your mind, or the other people that vote you, that's totally cool. But then that also gives us an indication of what frameworks you want to learn. And does that answer the question? And there was a question about the previous participation. Go ahead. Eric, you got a question? The country that I'm in has a fine on VPNs and TOR for personal use. In that case, I did post a video on the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which is a way of exchanging keys securely. It's a 3-minute video that I find super interesting. Just give that a watch and tell me about it in your participation. Cool. Are there any other questions, or shall I let you guys go for the day? All right, well, I'll post the lecture online as soon as I can. It usually takes about an hour to render, and my dog's probably like figuring it's walk time now. He's very well tuned to the end of these lectures, so I'll get it posted up when I return. Have a good weekend, guys.